I, Mills Edwin Godwin, Jr.
Swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States.
Swear that I shall support the Constitution.
I think Mills Godwin has made a tremendous contribution to our state. I think he certainly will go down in history, in my judgment, as one of our greatest governors. And I think the state has benefited tremendously from the fact that he did serve 8 years as our governor.
There's an integrity and character ingrained into our Virginia people that sets us aside and apart from most other states, and it's no question in my mind there's no higher honor than being governor of Virginia.
By almost any standard, Mills E. Godwin, Jr. was an extraordinarily successful politician. Over a 20-year period, he was never defeated in any of his campaigns. His 2 victories in gubernatorial races in 1965 and 1973 constituted a unique achievement in the Commonwealth's political history. Since 1851, no other individual has been voted into the office more than once. His first administration is widely regarded as a textbook example of effective leadership, path-breaking reforms in education, state finances, and a host of other areas. For many other Virginians, though, Mills Godwin became the symbol of less admirable qualities, of what they perceived as elitist values, support for racial discrimination, and of an excessively cozy relationship between corporate leaders and political insiders. First as a Democrat, and then after 1973 as a Republican, Godwin also played an important role in charting the future course of government and politics in the Old Dominion. For many Virginians, Godwin's name became virtually synonymous with effective leadership, good government, and progressive change.
The governor was born in Nansemond, which is a country county, in 1914, of a fairly affluent family. They had a nice farmhouse. It wasn't austere, but it was a nice farmhouse by all standards. He fished, he hunted, he played baseball, he went to school, didn't do too great, but he was president of his class, of course. Graduated from Chuckatuck High School and went on from there to William Mary, and his mother's grandmother and my mother's grandmother were sisters. So that makes us, I think, cousins. But in the days when we were on the same platform, making the speeches together, we had a little play going in which he would get up very dignifiedly in his austere way, say that young Tom Downing over here is a member of the family, yes, but he never accepted my family until I got to be governor. And then it's almost true. And then when I would get up, I would say, no, we didn't accept your side of the family, because we didn't think you were going to amount to a tinker's dam until you got to be governor. And he just loved that.
Godwin attended the College of William and Mary and earned his law degree from the University of Virginia. He then joined his cousin's law firm in Suffolk near his hometown of Chuckatuck. While studying for his law degree, Catherine Thomas Beale, a 3rd grade teacher and a newcomer to Chuckatuck, caught his eye. After a 3-year courtship, they were married in 1940.
Catherine Godwin was not some meek little lady without a thought of her own. She's an intelligent, vibrant woman, a former school teacher. She knows issues. She knows what is happening.
Ms. Godwin has always said she was not political. She didn't make speeches. That was his role, not hers. She was supportive. She went to events when she was included. Oftentimes the women were not included. It was a time when it was more the man's world.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 27-year-old Godwin applied for a naval commission and also applied for a special agent's position with the FBI. In early 1943, the FBI accepted his application a week before his naval commission arrived. In World War II, fate smiled on Mills Godwin. A combination of medical circumstances, military regulations, and fortunate timing saved him from risking possible death in naval service overseas. With the end of World War II, he returned to private law practice and began to cherish political ambitions.
I believe he told me once that fate and timing are almost as important as ability in a political career. And it certainly proved so in this case. When he was a young man practicing law, there was a gentleman named Willis Cohoon, a Democrat, very fine Democrat, who had represented Nansemond in the House of Delegates for 7 or 8 years. But Willis Cohoon, in maintaining this lofty seat, had failed to keep up the fences in Nansemond, which so frequently happens. You just forget to go back to the barber shops, forget to go back to the street corners, and it's a natural thing. Well, Mills was a newcomer, and he took in that breach. He went to the barber shops, he built local fences, and he won a victory against Willis Cohoon. So he went up to the General Assembly, where he was not very well welcome because they wanted a bird cohort there. Well, they had one in Mills, but didn't know at that time.
I recall going into the clerk's office of the House of Delegates shortly before the convening of the session to talk with the clerk of the House about a possible seating arrangement. And I was greeted by Colonel E. Griffith Dodson, then clerk of the House, and he said to me, "Young man, we operate here with a policy of the king is dead, long live the king."
From the late 40s to much of the 50s, Godwin began to make a place for himself in the Byrd Organization, Virginia's fiscally and politically conservative Democratic machine. His stay in the House of Delegates was brief, and he was disappointed in his committee assignments. In 1952, though, a series of unexpected events served to propel Godwin much closer to the centers of influence in Byrd-run Virginia.
Adlai Stevenson, Dwight D. Eisenhower presidential race, which was awfully controversial. The then Lieutenant Governor of Virginia was making a speech for Adlai Stevenson in southwest Virginia. He died while making that speech. Senator Stevens of Chesapeake immediately wanted to run for Lieutenant Governor's Collins seat. So Governor Battle called a meeting, special meeting, and a Democratic Central Committee met, and Stevens was named Lieutenant Governor, and then Mills Godwin said he wanted to run for the Senate seat vacated by Stevens, so he was named senator without opposition.
Talking to Catherine Godwin, I asked her what did he do his first year. She's not much of anything. That he sat and he listened. Mills was learning. He was listening. So I think that was a forbearance of what would become of Mills's career, because he wanted to learn the landscape, understand the issues, and then be prepared to deal with them when they came up.
We met in the Capitol in Richmond, and during those 50 years, we have been the closest, both personal and political friends. Personal friendship usually lasts a long time, but with political friendships, that's a very fragile commodity. And for two politicians to be close friends over a long period of time is a bit unusual. State Senator Godwin at that point and I were desk mates in the Virginia Senate. Mills had been in the House of Delegates prior to that time. And when he came to the Senate, we arranged, each of us arranged where we could be, share a two-desk place. We each had become close friends to the other by that point, at that point. And we had a community of interest because of our basic philosophy.
Starting in the 1920s, the Byrd Organization had provided Virginia with government that had been relatively honest and inexpensive. Pay-as-you-go financing, the avoidance of public debt, was an essential feature of their creed. Additionally, the Byrd organization vehemently defended the right-to-work law, which prohibited compulsory union membership. These were the issues that Godwin was raised on. The poll tax and other restrictive registration procedures had shaped and maintained an overwhelmingly white, predominantly middle-class electorate that supported the Byrd organization. But by the time that Mills Godwin started to ascend in the organization's ranks, that support had begun to shift. Attacks against machine rule and the poll tax were beginning to be heard more often. Meanwhile, Republicans and anti-Byrd Democrats were calling for immediate improvements in the state's colleges, jails, and mental hospitals. Then in 1954, the Supreme Court handed down its decision in the Brown versus Board of Education case, holding that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren further declared that offending school systems should commence racial integration with all deliberate speed. The 1956 legislative session in Virginia signaled the first steps toward the policy that the senior Byrd characterized as massive resistance, and this issue propelled Mills Godwin into the most controversial stage of his career.
Mass resistance came about because of a number of bills, legislative bills, that were passed to try to prevent the integration of schools in Virginia. There were two factions, one which wanted limited integration, the other which wanted no integration at all. And Governor Godwin was a leader in the Senate of the second group. These bills consisted of legislation which said that when a school was ordered to be integrated by the federal courts, that the governor would take over those schools and that they would be closed if necessary. And indeed, there were several schools closed in the state. When this happened, a division occurred in the state Senate, and the more conservative forces, that is the one that wanted some limited integration but did not want the schools closed, predominated. Eventually, the governor appointed a commission to try to work this out, and the commission came up with the idea of partial integration, but said that if particular individuals did not want to go to an integrated school, they could change. Godwin opposed that, and that was, he was unsuccessful in that.
When the era first commenced after the decision in 1954, the policy of the General Assembly as a whole, so far as I can recall, was one of trying the best that we could to resist the court decree by all honorable and legal means. I had never heard anyone in the General Assembly, or whatever political persuasion or philosophical event, say anything about going any further than we could go by legal means. And I think, as Governor Harrison has pointed out, the things that were done from that background and not by those who wanted to see a more violent, harsher action taken. If the courts would permit us to keep the schools segregated, keep them segregated as much as we could, we were very much interested in that. And I think that's what the people overwhelmingly desired at that time, and it took a period of conditioning before they were able to really understand what the decision of 1954 meant.
Mills Godwin firmly believed that the massive that integration would be the destruction of the public educational school system. He really believed it. And as such, he was a proponent of massive resistance as set forth by Senator Byrd. And he's one of the floor leaders of massive resistance. And he did it out of conscience, that he knew he was right.
Another reason was the fact that politically it was necessary for any South Side politician to at least oppose the integration of the races. So on the one hand, you have this opposition to integration. On the other hand, you have the fact that he and other Southsiders had been mixing with the blacks all their lives.
He just believed so sincerely deep in his bones that this would destroy public education and ruin the chances to promote public education. And so he fought it to the bitter end. When it was all over, he said, that's a past subject now, and we're going on to new things.
Massive resistance prevailed initially, and Godwin was one of the principal architects of its success. But after 4 years of school closings and segregationist legislation, the time for testing had come. As pressures increased to reopen the schools, the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, in a divided opinion, ruled that closing the schools and cutting off state funds to prevent integration violated the state constitution. For Godwin, this was a bitter defeat. His public image as a school-closing reactionary would resurface in one political campaign after another for the balance of his career. By 1961, Godwin had emerged as the Byrd Organization's candidate for lieutenant governor, campaigning on a ticket headed by Albertus Harrison. They won and secured landslide victories. When Godwin took office, there was very little evidence that he would be more than a business-as-usual Byrd Organization-style conservative. Yet improbable as it may seem, 4 years later he would campaign for governor as the state's foremost advocate of progress. How did Godwin reinvent himself? To begin with, his mentor, Governor Harrison, made economic development the main feature of his administration. At the same time, Congress enacted civil and voting rights laws and abolished the poll tax. These changes greatly increased the minority voting population. By 1964, the political landscape in Virginia had changed dramatically. President Johnson was running for re-election, and Godwin, ever pragmatic, had to make some difficult decisions. Despite reservations about the National Democratic Party's economic and racial liberalism, Godwin decided to support LBJ. To publicize his support, he and Catherine agreed to escort the president's wife on a whistle-stop tour of Virginia.
Well, Lyndon Johnson was the Democratic nominee for president. Lady Byrd, of course, is his wife. And the strategy of the Johnson campaign, insofar as Virginia was concerned, was to have Lady Byrd, Mrs. Johnson, ride the train from beginning in Alexandria and riding throughout the state of Virginia. And some of the politicians were not too anxious to be on the so-called Lady Byrd special, because some had lost some confidence in Lyndon Johnson and were not willing to be too close to him during the campaign.
Mills and Catherine didn't want to go, but they were loyal Democrats. I got on the train to Arlington too, and there were some people who didn't want to be where they were, and it showed up on their faces any more than it did on Lieutenant Governor Godwin and his wife. But they were good scouts. They went along with it, and we all waved and everything. And the train pulled off and went slowly down through the countryside to Richmond. And a funny thing happened in Richmond. The engineer of the train was very excited to be carrying this important crowd, and he missed his stopping point in Byrd Station there. And when he found it out, he jerked up on the brakes as quickly as he could. Well, when he did, all the people out waving windows and stuff like that fell flat on the floor, including Lady Byrd, including Miss Godwin, my wife. Everybody was flat on the floor. I know my wife was under Ms. Johnson. And he says, I hope I haven't hurt you. My wife says, Ms. Johnson, just get up off me. I think I'll be all right. But they were all on the floor of the train. Well, they got up, and then Lieutenant Governor Godwin introduced President Johnson to the crowd.
He very shrewdly consolidated his support among Democrats who normally would not be in his camp.
Politically, that train ride carried him to a 4-year stay in the governor's mansion. Only one obstacle remained. In November, he would have to defeat the Republican nominee, Linwood Holton. But backed by a unified Democratic Party, Godwin waged a highly effective campaign that attracted support even from labor unions and black political activists, groups that a few years earlier would never have dreamed of backing a slate of bird organization candidates. To enthusiastic audiences, Godwin pledged to implement an ambitious reform agenda, his program for progress.
If there is a watchword for our time, it is to move, to strike out boldly, to reach for the heights. The Commonwealth we love will always be Virginia, but Virginia too is of the nation, and it is by the nation's standards that we are now called upon to judge her. As we do, we will be prompted to still greater effort.
If he was going to have a legacy of a caretaker governorship and allow his neighbors to pass him by further, then he was not going to stand for that. And so he hit the ground running in January of '66.
The sales tax was probably the hardest thing that the governor had to do in his first administration, and also the most important, because everything else he wanted to do depended on the money it would bring in.
At that time, by happenstance mainly, because city charters would permit the levying of such a tax, several cities, being Norfolk and Newport News and several around the state, had already implemented a local sales tax. Well, that galvanized people in the rural areas to say, well, the cities are not going to get all the money, and the only way the rural areas could get it is to get on board for a statewide sales tax.
All the counties in Virginia, the most rural, conservative, no tax portion of the state, all clamoring to have a statewide sales tax so they could participate. Some of that money could come back home. And he could go out and say, now let me tell you, if we have a statewide sales tax, the money you spend in Culpeper will stay in Culpeper. And the money you spend in Enrico will come back to you. And so he's able to capture a timing there that was important.
Our sales tax is very comprehensive. You tax everything from coffins to cough drops, but not services, not haircuts or beauty or shoe shines.
When you add that to the fact that we were moving into a new era in the Commonwealth, one in which quality of life was improving, there was a significant concern about things such as our mental health program and some basic services that we didn't really stack up well nationally speaking throughout the country.
The Assembly's approval of the sales tax marked the first really significant expansion of Virginia's revenue system in almost 2 decades. Nevertheless, Godwin soon discovered he would need still more money to fund all of the Program for Progress initiatives. But where would the money come from? Virginia's Constitution permitted the state to borrow money during periods of financial emergency, but this would violate the principle of pay-as-you-go. With the fate of his Program for Progress hanging in the balance, Godwin moved to sever a major link with his and Virginia's past. He urged the Assembly to pass capital fund bond issues to pay for construction of colleges and mental health facilities. The proposal met with surprisingly little resistance from the lawmakers. Eventually, more than 1 million Virginians voted to approve the measure. For Godwin, the vote was a vindication of himself and his program. It was, he exulted, a mandate to get moving.
North Carolina and South Carolina had developed community colleges long before we did. Virginia was one of the last states to have a community college system. So it seemed needless to reinvent wheels if we could learn from our colleagues. And they were most generous in advising us and counseling us. He provided the means whereby we improved the public schools through the sales tax. He provided the means to create the comprehensive community college system of the Commonwealth. He provided means to upgrade facilities, to provide salary increases for both public school teachers and professors and staff members of universities and colleges. He provided a seamless web for future generations in education in the Commonwealth.
Governor Harrison started economic development, but it really began to manifest itself. I sensed a feeling of industrial people having confidence in the potential quality of life and the quality of atmosphere during the Godwin administration. And that was important. It was almost a period of we need to consolidate now and show people that we have the capacity, having come out of massive resistance and having come out of social turmoils of the past, that we have the capacity in the Commonwealth to provide the leadership that's necessary to move the state forward. And Godwin personified that.
Well, I think he saw education and economic development tied together, and the standard of living of their citizens. And so, to a large extent, they were all of a piece. But he was able to go abroad, and I think we were the first state to make an overture to foreign markets entirely on the basis of a state of effort. Heretofore, the federal government had been involved in any efforts of that sort. He opened an office in Brussels that was a big stimulus to interest in Virginia and that country.
He made some good decisions in bringing on board some good economic development people who had the capacity to put programs together. And that's the first time we'd had that in the state.
Tourism was boosted largely during his administration. A lot of people don't know that Virginia's for Lovers was developed during his administration. The subsequent governors, I think, have recognized that it was a sterling tool for interesting people in what we had to offer here in Virginia.
We have had in Virginia, since our independence in 1776, now 6 constitutions. The Constitution we had in 1901, 1902 was a result of a convention. It was a long, detailed, out-of-date type of constitution where it wasn't clear what the powers and functions of government were. And in the 1960s, again in America, there was a movement all over the country ready to reform state constitutions, we being one of them. Professor A.E. Howard up here at the University of Virginia was the constitutional advisor to the Blue Ribbon Commission that Governor Godwin appointed of very distinguished judges and professors and citizens around Virginia that came up with a document. They worked on it about a year or so, and then it was submitted to the General Assembly, and we went in session twice to adopt it.
And of course, each article of the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, was assigned to certain committees. Certain portions were assigned to the certain committees that were already in place. And they hashed out for 2 months the new Constitution. Some had to do with education. It retained the one-term governor. It involved a new limit whereby monies could be borrowed and how much money could be borrowed. But Governor Godwin admonished all to obviously take their own prejudices to the General Assembly, but conduct their business in a manner that would be to the good of the state, not just a part of the state.
I remember this was the 60s when all kinds of things were going along on college campuses and in various other riots that took place. And Godwin was determined this was not going to happen in Virginia, at least as long as he was governor. And one of the ways that he thought it necessary to stop some of this was to tighten up, including the death penalty for certain things. The House was more liberal than the Senate, and there was some opposition in the House to it, but it passed.
The Klan did rear its head in certain areas of Virginia in that period, even to the extent that they burned a cross on the sidewalk right behind the governor's mansion. And we made some arrests, and there were some sentences meted out to those that were convicted, and it had a real deterring effect. The imperial wizard of the Klan in Virginia and North Carolina asked for a conference with me, and I agreed to it at the state capitol, and this would have been in the spring of 1967. And their complaint largely was that our state police was interfering with the Klan gatherings, and they thought they were being taken advantage of because of the presence of the state police. And I insisted that the state police had a proper role to play and that I didn't think we needed the KKK in Virginia, and that it would be my purpose to do everything that I could and use whatever resources were available to us to see that they did not start any programs in this state, or that they could function as an effective weapon to carry out the aims of their organization in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Godwin's program for progress produced tangible results for Virginia. New interstate construction, seaport improvements, new mental health facilities, more land for state parks, higher environmental standards, and more support for the arts. But in the opinion of the press, these achievements were overshadowed by the transformation of Virginia's educational system and the development of community colleges. Occasional legislative setbacks notwithstanding, Godwin's performance as governor had been masterful. He had achieved almost all of his objectives, but even Godwin was not immune to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. He experienced one potentially disastrous brush with fate in July 1967 when his limousine was rammed by an intoxicated driver. Slightly more than a year later, he and his wife would experience suffering in a much more indelible and tragic fashion.
It must have been the greatest tragedy in the lives of Mills and Catherine Godwin.
Becky was an adopted daughter and the apple of both Governor and Miss Godwin's eyes. Governor Godwin particularly was fond of children, and of course Miss Godwin was. Becky was at Camp Pendleton. In fact, the family was at Camp Pendleton after Miss Godwin had been in an accident and broken her ankle, but she was recuperating at Camp Pendleton with the family, and Becky was on the beach, and there was a distant storm. Nobody even realized that it was close enough, and she was struck by lightning. She died a few days later.
It obviously was very difficult for her going back to the home in Chuckatuck and also second term coming back to Richmond. I think if everything else had been equal, she would have preferred not to be tested in that way. But they're both very religious people, and they accepted what had happened and went on from there. But it was a tragic occurrence, and I think after that, you know, the atmosphere was a little more somber around the governor's office.
In the course of Godwin's first term, it became obvious that the improbable coalition that elected him was beginning to splinter. Civil rights groups and black editors began to criticize Godwin for failing to make enough minority appointments, and organized labor chided him because he would abide no changes in Virginia's right-to-work law. More troubling, however, was the emergence from the party's most liberal wing of a truly formidable contender for the 1969 Democratic nomination for governor.
Where millions of dollars in tax money, education money, your children's money is involved, I promise I'll watch it and make sure it goes where it's supposed to go, every last penny. There's a lot of things that go around in the dark besides Santa Claus.
Keep the big boys honest. Let's make Henry Howell our governor.
Henry Howell was an ardent Great Society Democrat on national issues and an irrepressible extrovert. Characterizing himself as the people's candidate, he urged his supporters to join him in the struggle against the politics of anointment and appointment. Godwin believed that Howell should not become governor of the Commonwealth. At the end of his term, Godwin made no secret of his preference for William Battle in the Democratic primary runoff against Howell. On the Republican ticket, Linwood Holton was once again waging a vigorous, charismatic campaign for Virginia's highest office. That November, the Commonwealth elected its first Republican governor in more than 80 years. Godwin's term as governor thus ended on a paradoxical note. While he was successful in turning promises into realities, he was unable to unify his party or reinvigorate the old Byrd organization. Praised by supporters and the press, Godwin was now, for the first time in 2 decades, no longer in public life.
Godwin had a problem after he left the governorship the first time because he couldn't go back to his law practice. Much of his law practice had been with state agencies, and Godwin couldn't do that after he was governor. Plus the fact that he had appointed judges and a few things like that. So he became a board member of a number of corporations. He also was a speaker that was so much in demand that he was speaking almost every other night.
As the Democratic Party continued its shift to the left, Virginia's Republicans were moving in the opposite direction and began to put out the welcome mat for conservatives. Not surprisingly, Mills Godwin was singled out for special attention. He soon found himself in the curious situation of being strongly recruited by a party he had always opposed. He had 3 options. He could remain a Democrat, defect to the Republican Party, or follow his friend Harry F. Byrd Jr. and pursue an independent course. Henry Howell was continuing his quest for governor, this time as an independent. Godwin was determined to block his path. Godwin had to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life.
Mills Godwin had said, "I became a Republican and did not desert the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party changed and deserted me."
He was very concerned that the Commonwealth had an image of dignity and he wanted to retain. Henry Howell was a populist through and through. He made sometimes George Wallace look respectable. And that simply, I think, made Governor Godwin do what he did. In his mind, I think he was doing it to, some people say, save the Commonwealth. The inclination was that he would run as an independent, much as Senator Byrd did in 1970, after he left the Democratic Party. The delicacy was convincing Governor Godwin that if he ran as an independent, that the Republican Party in Virginia would nominate a candidate. And by doing that, he could not win the election. Neither could the Republican. Lieutenant Governor Howell would be elected. These negotiations were led on the Republican side by the state Republican chairman, Richard D. Obenshain. He was the diplomat to Governor Godwin. And the two of them built a rapport. An attorney and a friend of Dick's named D. Dortch Warner, who was later a federal judge, played the heavy. And he told, in no uncertain terms, Governor Godwin that he would, if he had to, run as the Republican candidate for governor, if Godwin chose to run as an independent. The personalities involved were such that at any point along the way, and that includes up to and including the press conference where Governor Godwin was going to announce his intentions, the original press release did not include the words, "If nominated, I will run as a Republican. If he had not extemporaneously put that in the press conference, Dorch Warner was prepared to run as a Republican candidate.
The campaign in 1973 was a long campaign. At times it was bitter, and it was a sharp clash between two opposing political philosophers. And I was running as one who had just joined the Republican Party.
Issues were important, of course. There was busing, and it played a role. There was the repeal of the sales tax on food and non-prescription drugs, and it played a role. But I think the overriding issue was leadership in Virginia.
The campaign was much more about Mills, Godwin, Henry Howe, and the sort of large images that they represented than hot-button issues. Now, there were hot-button issues used, but almost every hot-button issue was either to Henry Howe saying, I'm pushing this button to remind you that Mills Godwin represents big corporations and major business, or the Godwin campaign pushing buttons to remind everybody that Henry Howe was this dangerous radical who would upturn Virginia tradition and the world would be turned upside down and nothing would be the same again.
People who have characterized '73 election as Armageddon, in my mind, are overly dramatic. It was an important election in Virginia history as to the direction that the state's government would take. There could have been the beginnings of major change in how Virginia was governed. It was an important election. It was, I didn't think, a particularly nasty election. Yes, the issues were sharp. The dialogue was tough. That's what good elections are about. That's how the voters are informed of how people feel about things. One thing to remember, both Governor Godwin and Lieutenant Governor Howe were well known to the people of Virginia, and how they looked at governance was well known.
6 months out from the election night, a reporter, Steve Fleming, who was with the Times-Dispatch, wrote an article which scared everybody to death and woke up a lot of people, because a lot of people thought Mills Godwin cannot lose a campaign. Banner headlines saying, Henry Howe blazes trail across state. Godwin follows limply in wake. What I was observing on the road was Mills Godwin was a reluctant campaigner. He was, in fact, very aware of his dignity as the governor. And in Virginia, of course, once you're the governor forever. So it was always Governor Godwin. And he simply didn't like meet and greet style campaigning. Godwin moved through Southside Virginia about a week after Henry Howe campaigned through the same area. And Howe had been at the top of the newspapers in every locality. There were posters everywhere we went. I followed Godwin, not Howe. There were posters everywhere we went, Henry Howe posters. You go into restaurants, and there were Henry Howe posters over the cash register, because Henry couldn't pass by a public place without popping in and saying, will you put up one of my posters? I'm going to take a picture of you and me with a Polaroid camera. You know, you're going to have a picture with Henry Howe, the next governor of Virginia. Godwin didn't like that kind of stuff. And he didn't go to a lot of those places. He went to carefully scheduled events. He talked too long. And then he got in the car and he went to the next scheduled event and talked too long again. And that's essentially what I reported. But what they saw, of course, was that Godwin looked cold and distant, while Howe was warm, bubbly, and all of that.
You see, we didn't have a long-time organization in each town and city of Virginia. We were still just appealing generally through campaigning and news reports. And we felt that some number of people will wait to see who's going to be the winner. And that if they saw a legitimate poll that I was a winner, that they would be more affirmatively for me, and it would stimulate our volunteers who were working so hard.
Polls in 1973 were few and far between. If a campaign ran 2 polls in the entire campaign, that was big. It's not like it is today, where you poll every 10 minutes to find out who's thinking what about what. What happened was it galvanized what I call the conservative independents, who were part of the old Byrd machine, who were supporting Governor Godwin, and made them understand that the election wasn't a cinch. And it galvanized the Republicans, who were in some disarray and having a very bad time coming to grips with Watergate, which we were right in the middle of. So it was helpful to our campaign.
I think it was a realization for everybody that there was a chance that the next governor might not be Republican. And that inspired, I think, the coalition people, the Republicans, to roll up their sleeves and do what they do best, to get to that vote and make it turn out. And I think that the poll was a godsend, because we really needed a shot of B12, and it gave it to us.
It was close. I mean, Governor Godwin got 50.7% of the vote in a 2-way race. That's a very narrow margin. And as it turned out, with the victory, Governor Godwin's victory being less than 15,000 votes, a 3-way race would have been a catastrophe for him.
I, Mills Edwin Godwin, Jr.
I, Mills Edwin Godwin, Jr.
Swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States.
Swear that I shall support the Constitution of the
Taking the oath of office in January 1974, Godwin confronted a very different situation than when he had first moved into the executive mansion 8 years earlier. Now, in the mid-1970s, inflation and recession stalked the land, and an oil embargo by the Arab world plagued the West. Confidence in the nation's leaders and politicians in general had been weakened by Vietnam and Watergate. Cynicism was rampant. Could Godwin govern in this transformed environment? Although his first administration's theme was progress, events would quickly show the new watchwords were crisis and controversy, beginning with Godwin's push for the reinstatement of the death penalty.
There was the crises of, first of all, in the penitentiary. The federal judge in Richmond had demanded that certain reforms take place. These reforms had taken place, but as a result of that, prisoners were escaping and were creating all kinds of problems. So the first thing that the governor had to do was to try to straighten out the prison system, which he did. The second thing that hit him was the shortage of gas and oil because of the crisis in the Near East.
The Arabs put an embargo on fuel or oil to this country. That required a rationing of gasoline in Virginia. That required a law, which was one of his initiatives, that you couldn't raise the thermostat in your home higher than 65 degrees. If you had an odd license number, you couldn't buy fuel on the even days. So those things went into play. All of those dynamics were just one portion of his second term.
When he came in as a Republican, I was there as a Democrat, and it was not, we didn't talk about it much. It was still mostly Democrats, and he'd been friends with all of us, really. But he did have, I remember talking with him about 9 months to 10 months into his session. He said, I've had to work harder in these 10 months I did for 4 years.
As time went on, the legislature began to balk more against the governor than they had in his early years, the first 2 years of administration. Third year was the crisis for this. And he did have to make some compromises there.
In the second term, he ran, as all of us ran, into a recession. And the monies were lower. and he didn't have the revenues to do things. Therefore, he, under our Constitution, had to cut things, and he cut across the board quietly by order. And people absorbed those cuts, so he could not do a lot of things that he did.
And one of the saddest things he had to do was to stop fishing in the James River, and which is an area where he had been so close to, putting out 1,500 to 2,500 fishermen, and that was their livelihood. In Hopewell, the Allied Chemical Company was accused of spilling chemicals into the James River, which meant that's the reason they had to close the fishing. They were brought to trial, and then later they worked out a kind of a unique system and created the Virginia Environmental Fund, in which the governor and Allied met, and under the auspices of Judge Marriage, and they created, and Allied agreed to put, I think at that time was $18 million in the fund, and now that is still a fund that is dispersed out for environmental purposes, and that was one of his big environmental problems, as well as others.
Godwin disappointed some groups during his second term. Organized labor was unhappy when he blocked a state minimum wage bill and a bill that would have allowed public employees to meet and confer about grievances. Civil rights groups criticized the state's minority hiring practices and his appointments, even though they compared favorably with his predecessor, Governor Holton. The federal courts called for more integration in Virginia's colleges. After he left office, returning home to Cedar Point, Mills Godwin, along with his wife Catherine, resumed a life much like that which they had shared in the years between the two gubernatorial terms. He stayed active in the Republican Party, supported the successful campaign of John Dalton for governor, and became the elder statesman and consultant for the Republican Party. Ultimately, what are we to make of Mills Godwin? It seems apparent that whatever else he may have been, the Commonwealth's only twice-elected governor was a remarkably astute political tactician. Certain core beliefs profoundly shaped his public conduct, whether he was campaigning as a moderate or a conservative, a Democrat or a Republican. He was always an earnest defender of free enterprise and individual opportunity. He was, as well, a consistent advocate of states' rights, which he viewed as an integral part of Virginia's heritage. On racial issues, he was rarely, if ever, to be found on the egalitarian side of the political spectrum. Although suspicious of federal judges and bureaucrats, he was never an opponent of governmental action, particularly at the state and local levels. On the contrary, he was convinced that government had important duties to perform and services to render. Furthermore, he believed that Virginians should be willing to pay reasonable taxes to support those services. These were his principles in the 40s and 50s. They were still his principles in the 1970s, when he left a Democratic Party that, as he saw it, had moved in a different direction. They remained his principles to his last day.